Welcome to the show, everybody. I want to remind each of you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. On YouTube, it's called Film Talk Radio, and you can watch more than 130 shows. I'm pleased today to be joined by author, Emmy Award winning writer, and producer Kirk Ellis. Kirk, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jack. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, I think this is the third or fourth one that you've done, and the
I
first
can't
one.
remember. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we did Silent Film and Murder. We talked about
Oh,
John
man.
Adams. But today we're talking Ride Lonesome, the pinnacle film of the Ranown series by Boetticher, and really amazing movie, solid Western. And the book really gives you a insight into what it took to make this movie and the significance of these films. The 1959 film starring Randolph Scott just blew me away. I had never seen it, so I'm so excited to talk to you about especially the book, but also the film.
Great. No, I'm happy to. It's one of my favorite films and one of my favorite series, and two of my great mentors in life, both professionally and personally. Bud Boetticher, the director, and Burt Kennedy, the writer. So,
So I guess let's start out with the Renown films with Bud Boetticher, with Burt Kennedy. That's how the book starts, basically. But tell me, or
sure,
tell
you
the
need to.
audience. Let's
Yeah,
ease
let's
into the water.
put things in a little bit of context. I mean, Bud and Burt, let alone Randolph Scott, didn't really see themselves making this series of films. It was sort of christened many years thereafter, first by French critics and then by American critics. But the name Renown takes its name from the production company that was formed by Randolph Scott, the Ray, and his producing partner, Harry Joe Brown, so Renown. But only two of the movies are actually Renown productions, Ride Lonesome and the film that followed, Comanche Station. But the collaboration began in 1956 on a movie called Seven Men from Now that Bud directed. It was Burt Kennedy's first script. It starred Randolph Scott in this sort of new Western hero. It was this was the period after the war. They're very much atomic age westerns. There's a bleakness and a starkness to them. The sense of the value system that the classic John Ford westerns promulgated no longer really exists. So between 1956 and 1960, six films were made by this team of people. Burt didn't write all of them, but he wrote the four best ones. So you had Seven Men from Now, Decision Sundown, The Tall T, um, Buchanan Rides Alone, Ride Lonesome, and Comanche Station. And they are known collectively as the Renown films. But again, the filmmakers never saw it. So, oh, we're doing a whole closed universe kind of thing. That was left for critics to determine later on. They were simply making a style of westerns they had made before with a tremendous amount of freedom away from the studio system, because the movies were low budget films. They were B pictures that sometimes rose to A minus level of budget, but you're talking about $350,000 with an average shooting schedule of 13 days. So they were really off the radar, which is why they were able to pack as much stuff into those movies as they could.
And yeah, I think a really good B movie like Ride Lonesome, maybe an A minus, like you said. They don't have the big budget, but it leans heavily on the writing and acting. So, where they don't have as much money for the cavalry or whatever it would have been in those days, they really have a solid script, and I think it joins the ranks of what we consider more serious westerns, or
For sure.
and
Yeah, I mean, it's no, go ahead. Sorry.
oh,
Yeah.
and it finds its place within these western movies as a very solid film.
Yeah, I mean, the movies have been acclaimed for quite a while, but they were out of circulation for a very, very long time. And it wasn't until it was Columbia finally remastered the films and put them out on DVD over a decade ago. I still have that first edition DVD, and then it went out of print. And subsequently, Criterion has essentially revived those old discs and added some other extras. So they're getting out into the world again. But these were films that were made to fit, double bills. They never played on their own. They weren't. Sometimes they played at the top of the double bill. Sometimes they were at the bottom of the double bill. And this was a period where people all put all kinds of films together. There was a theater somewhere in the Midwest that put Ride Lonesome together with The Sound and the Fury, Martin Ritt's Faulkner adaptation with Yul Brynner. So there was, it's just kind of hysterical how all this, how all these distribution systems worked out. But they're really, your tastes change over time. But I've always been very drawn to these sort of lesser known films and filmmakers, whether it's Bud or it's somebody like Anthony Mann, who was his direct contemporary, working on a much bigger canvas with his films with James Stewart at the time. But these westerns that came out of World War II that bridged the gap between the sort of classical storytelling of John Ford and what, for one of a better term, is called the revisionist storytelling of the late 1960s and early 70s. And you really see in a movie like Ride Lonesome this sort of almost nihilistic approach to the genre. Burt called these movies talk treks because he was writing for the budget, so you had to carefully structure the story so that you had just a burst of action here and there, but the rest of it was carried on by characters. And we do say that about every film, but these westerns are particularly focused on finding the similarities between those who walk on what is called the good side of the law and those who walk on the bad side. The great innovation of the Ranown films and the way Scott played those characters, whether it's Ben Brigade in this film or characters he's essentially the sort of same figure in all these movies, just refracted into different styles. But the Ranown films blur the line between hero and villain, and often the so-called villain characters, whether it's Pernell Roberts and a very young James Coburn in this film and Ride Lonesome, his film debut, are more interesting in many ways than the protagonist himself. And that led to some really interesting casting where you had Scott, this sort of old guard Hollywood actor, playing with these young Turks, many of them coming up through the actor's studio with new acting techniques. And there's a real one thing that's not talked about a lot about these films is the generational conflicts. The opponents are always a generation younger than Scott himself, and sometimes they travel in gangs of young men. And you're seeing this transformation of the West from something that was into something that's going to be the chaos of what becomes the Sergio Leone movies. That's what makes him so timely. And Ride Lonesome, I picked when UNM Press came to a number of us for this still ongoing series called Real West. That's real spelled with two E's. Get it? And my proposal is that of all the Ranown films, this film was the apotheosis of everything that Burt and Bud were trying to do, and it really represents that. It's just one of the most spare movies I or anybody else has ever seen in terms of it's four characters. Like all the other films, it was shot at Lone Pine, which is pretty much halfway between LA and Tahoe. And you've got Mount Whitney in the background. It's this remarkable concentration of prehistoric rock formations that are really otherworldly. And so, particularly Ride Lonesome almost seems to be taking place on a different planet. People are the journey's already begun when the movie starts, the movie ends before it's over, and you don't even know where you are historically. That's the other great thing about the Ranown films. They're not historical dramas. There's an occasional reference to something that you may be able to date it with, but they take place out of time.
And I guess a renowned villain often will surprise you. In this film, it's the scene where he has the chance to let Randolph Scott's character get shot, but Boone, James, is it Coburn's character?
But yeah, yeah, wit, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, oh, Wig, excuse me. Yeah, and so he saves the life of this protagonist, and that's uncharacteristic of a villain, but of a renowned villain. It's
It's yeah, it's
typical.
not the first time that happens in a renowned film. You've got Pernell Robertson playing the character Boone and his young partner Wid, um, who are both after the same quarry, the human bounty that Randall Scott's character is bringing with him to justice. But in all these movies, the theoretical villain is responsible for some fashion of saving the life of the hero, um, in a chance where it's not necessarily to his benefit, but these guys actually like each other. That's one of the great things. Tall T, the film that comes a couple before Ride Lonesome, really makes that clear. And Bud said about that movie that I always thought it was possible for two men to love each other in a platonic way. And you almost want Randolph Scott and Richard Boone to go off together into the sunset and leave the heroine behind. But this being a Western, that's not going to happen. And without any spoilers in Ride Lonesome, for those who may want to see the film after they read the book or watch this interview, the film has a very unique denouement that isn't typical either of a renowned film or of a Western.
And you brought up the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, there must be some influence there, or some stylistic. That was the movie it brought me right to, where it's sparse. There's not a lot going on yet. You can't take your eyes off it.
And it's funny because Bud always liked to tell a story, whether it was apocryphal or not. You can never tell with Bud how much was truth and how much was fiction, but I tend to believe this one. In later life, when he was attending a lot of film festivals and getting a lot of recognition, he happened to be in Italy and he saw Sergio Leone come sort of bounding down the staircase. And Leone was this big, bearish guy. And he said, Bud, I stole everything from you. And that's, really true. I mean, these movies, and Ride Lonesome in particular, not just Bud hated it, ended in a kind of bullfight scenario. And the shootout at the end of Ride Lonesome, which takes place in this circular bosque that really resembles a bullfight ring, very much something that Leone recalls in all of his climactic shootouts, whether it's for a few dollars more or the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Clint Eastwood, who encountered the veteran actor while in the midst of his own rise to Western icondom, remembered Scott as, quote, a very impressive guy. He always stood very straight, and he had that kind of stoic thing, but also a very great charm. And so,
So here's the, yeah. So here's the thing people don't really remember about Randolph Scott because he's such an iconic Western figure. Scott was one of the richest men in Hollywood. And unlike actors then and now who will sit on the set or in their trailers reading, Hard Reporter, Variety, or now Deadline Hollywood, he didn't read any of that. He read the Wall Street Journal, and he checked on his stocks, his cattle, and his oil investments. That was his real interest. And he had been a working actor, I mean, since, the transition from silent to sound, famously or notoriously as Cary Grant's long-term roommate in their early years in Hollywood. He did romantic comedies. He was in a musical at RKO. I mean, it's he worked in everything, but he became known as this Western icon. And the story both Bud and Burt tell about his casting in Seven Men from Now, the film that really kicked off the series, is that Burt was under contract as a writer for Bat Jack Productions, John Wayne's company, working out of Warner Brothers. But Wayne didn't want to play the part. At the time, he was playing Ethan Edwards in The Searchers, and this was yet another sort of character on a quest, who's maybe not, maybe a little bit too obsessive, didn't want to play him. So he brings, Bud and Burt together. And then they meet as a triumvirate, and it's, who are we going to cast? And, for a while it was going to be Robert Preston, who at that point had turned his back on Hollywood. And there were many other people considered. And finally, Wayne said to Bud and Burt, I know who we get. We get Randolph Scott. He's through, meaning his career's finished. Now, that wasn't true. At the time, Randolph Scott was still one of the top 10 box office stars in Hollywood. But, Bud never tired of saying, so we took Randolph Scott and we shoved him up John Wayne's. And of course, Wayne lived to regret not having played those roles, but it's impossible now to look at any of those films, from Seven Men from Now all the way through Comanche Station, and imagine anybody but Randolph Scott in the role. And he was an incredible gentleman. And that was shown in his affection for his younger co-stars, the people playing opposite him as the antagonist. The story about Ride Lonesome is that they're up in Lone Pine shooting, and Bud and Burt and Scott go out to dinner at one of the one or two restaurants that Lone Pine had to offer in the late 1950s. And they're talking over steak and drinks, and Scott says, who's that young fellow the young fellow wearing the red BVD underwear I played a scene with today? And Burt says, that's young actor named James Coburn. He says, I like that young man. Let's give him some more lyrics. And so that night, Bud and Burt went back to their rooms at the Dow Hotel, not far from where they're shooting, and wrote a scene that wasn't in the script, doesn't exist anywhere in any of the printed versions of the script that Burt made available to me in the years I knew him. And it's one of the great scenes in Ride Lonesome where the two ostensible bad guys have this buddy moment that always brings down the house about what they're going to do once Brigade is out of the picture and they've collected the bounty money. It's great. And it's the kind of thing that wouldn't have happened without Randolph Scott showing his generosity.
Both Peter Bogdanovich and Martin Scorsese were fans of the film. And I guess you also draw a contrast between John Wayne and Cary Grant versus Randolph Scott, but you already touched on that a little bit. What else is there to say there, if anything?
In terms of Randolph Scott himself?
Yeah, in terms of comparing him to John Wayne or a Cary Grant, and then just the movie in general and why Scorsese or Bogdanovich.
Well, I think that at this point in time, Scott had played everything he wanted to play. He really did. But these movies and the character that Burt wrote for him. Remember, Burt is coming out into Hollywood as a veteran of World War II. Not only World War II, but the Pacific Campaign, and not only the Pacific Campaign, but the retaking of the Pacific after Bataan and Corregidor. And he always liked to joke. He said, MacArthur liked to say, I shall return, but why did he have to take us with him? And Burt was a remarkably humble individual, just a delightful raconteur. But what people didn't know about him, and what I had to sort of learn long after his death in the research for this book, is that as a young soldier, he participated in the um, the liberation of the largest civilian POW camp in the Pacific, the Santo Tomas camp outside of Manila. And it won him a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, and these things were um, citations that he had in his office in Studio City. Never really spoke about it. He always liked to joke. He goes, "I was in the Fifth Cavalry, in World War II."
Kirk, I know, and written by Burt Kennedy too. Kirk, I know you had a personal friendship with both Bud Boetticher and Burt Kennedy. Let me hear about that. I mean, I think the beginning of the book invites us into that, and I can't wait to hear more.
So I had a really gifted professor at USC, University of Southern California Film School, Richard B. Jewell, who's now retired. But I took a genre class with him on Westerns. And at one point, he showed Ride Lonesome. And as I say in the book, of course, Ride Lonesome was the bottom half of a double bill. That class, I think it was Winchester 73 was the other film, Anthony Mann's film from a few years earlier. But I'd never seen Bud Boetticher film. I knew Burt, growing up in Texas and in the West. Burt wrote Support Your Local Sheriff and The War Wagon and these sort of comic westerns. So he was a known quantity, but I'd never seen, a Bud film. So, and this we saw it on a CinemaScope print at the big theater at Norris Theater at USC, and I was like a lot of us completely blown away. And I thought, I gotta see more of this. The film really resonated with me. Its sense of loneliness. And I was very introverted at the time. And I must admit, my bleak worldview hasn't changed much in all those years, but that was the other thing that really attracted me. So, as an undergraduate, I got to know Bud's work really well with everything we could find in the archives. And I ended up doing the first comprehensive Bud Boetticher retrospective in the US as a result of this research. We staged it one summer in USC in the 80s. And I got to know Bud before. I'd go down to he was then raising Portuguese Lusitano horses down at a ranch in San Diego County. And so I'd go back and forth to get to know him and find out what films we should show. Of course, his bullfighting film, Arusa, was our closing night film. And we had Peter Bogdanovich there for the opening night, which is how I got to know that there was this whole cult of film directors who were also big Bud fanatics. And that led to a long-term relationship with both Bud and Burt that lasted not only beyond the retrospective, but beyond my undergraduate years. And Bud and I became associates on some of his late life scripts that he was trying to get set up as feature films, none of which came to fruition, regrettably. And partly that was due to the change in the industry, partly it was due to Bud's personality. We can certainly talk about as much of that as you want, but that's what it led to. But I had 4 years of film school, at my parents' expense at USC. Learned everything I needed to know about film from Bud and Burt. Not only about storytelling, and the lesson from Burt was always, you can always tell less of a story. You can always do it with less dialogue. You can do it with fewer scenes. You just have to constantly boil things down. But while he and Bud were not, they were perfectly matched in the sense that Bud was a bit of a wild man, and Burt was a bit more down to earth and a bit more centered. But they were both mavericks, and they did not suffer fools easily, which is why they loved making these Ranown films together. Because what Warner Brothers executive or Columbia executive at the time is going to go to Lone Pine, California? There wasn't even an airstrip; just landed in the desert to go there. So you could be fairly independent, and that was the way they liked to do things. And they shot economically. There wasn't a lot of footage to be had. The films cut together pretty much one way and no other way, so Bud could maintain a certain amount of control that he didn't have on some of his larger budget films from Universal that had come before. And so that sense of independence and always making sure that you weren't compromising unduly, that you were staying true to your own sense of story has always stayed with me.
Now, is there anything that didn't make the book concerning your friendship with Bud in particular? I imagine there was more that ended up edited out or that you didn't get to tell in the book.
So the last chapter of the book is really about what happened after this retrospective, and Bud and I got into business together, got into a personal and professional partnership, and it didn't end well. And I tell the story of one particular film, which was a wonderful script he had called A Horse for Mr. Barnum, about three cowboys at the sort of, end of the 19th, dawn of the 20th century, who were sent by P.T. Barnum personally to Spain to round up these Lusitano horses for his circus. And they adventures ensue. It's a very picaresque sort of narrative that involves gypsies and internecine warfare, and it was really a lot of fun. A big old-fashioned romantic story. There were two other scripts, including one based on Bud's own experiences of a 10-year odyssey and descent into madness in Mexico, making his bullfighting film Arusa. But that one film sort of stood in as a synecdoche for what happened with working with Bud as a director from a certain generation, trying to find his footing in the new cinema of that time. And this time we're talking about the 90s and the early 2000s. And it was an education for me, and it ended obviously disappointingly. Bud and I ended up not on speaking terms, and he died back in 2000 before we could be reconciled. And so there's always that regret. And one of the reasons for writing the book was really to repay what I thought was a 40-year-old debt to both men for everything that they taught me, and to try to distill some of their spirit into the narrative of what I thought was their greatest piece of work together. But Bud's story about not being able to get a project off the ground, and we were very, very close. We were very close to having this film done by Pedro Almodovar's company, El Deseo. And I'd been very careful, having seen the deals blow apart before, to make sure that Bud and Almodovar's company didn't speak directly until we had a contract. But somehow he found out how to get hold of them. And I was at the Cannes Film Festival market at the time, and I had just seen Agustin Almodovar, who did all of El Deseo's business. I think he still does. And they had translated the script in Spanish. They had a budget. They had a potential set of casting. The great Spanish actress Victoria Abril was going to be in the film. We had Robert Mitchum lined up to play Barnum. Coburn was going to be the lead cowboy. I mean, it's a good package. And I remember there was the Carlton Hotel where they were doing business. There was a revolving door there. I remember seeing Augustine come out of the revolving door. He saw me and he went right back in the revolving door into the lobby of the hotel. And I knew at that moment, he said, Bud called him. And that's exactly what happened. But that story wasn't unique to Bud. You read about this with people like George Cukor, Billy Wilder, in late career, who couldn't get projects off the ground. And to a certain degree, yes, the industry was to blame, but it was also Bud's fault, because I think he felt this fear that, yes, I can do this, but maybe if I can't, what are people going to say about me? So it was easier to have a project that was always almost about to come to fruition than to have an actual movie that might fail. That's ultimately what I didn't say in the book, but that was the conclusion I finally came to.
And Burt Kennedy, what was that friendship like? Did you learn a lot from him?
Yeah, I mean, even after Bud and I sort of blew apart. Uh, Burt and I stayed close. Um, when he turned 70, Burt always had his annual 70th birthday party. And he had, I think, 9 of them before he died, and I was there for 7 of them. And Jacques, these events were unbelievable. It was Hollywood royalty. You never knew who was going to be coming there. It was all the, Ernest Borgnine, James Arness, Harry Morgan, all the people he'd worked with. Bud and Mary, his wife, came to a couple of them. But because of Burt's wartime heroism, it wasn't just Hollywood who came. It was all the, Ernest Borgnine, James Arness, Harry Morgan, all the people he'd worked with. Bud and Mary, his wife, came to a couple of them. But because of Burt's wartime heroism, it wasn't just Hollywood who came. Even if they weren't present, they would send memos or cards. I remember one of these events, there were tributes to Burt from John McCain and Colin Powell, who were, so it's like, this was not your typical Hollywood party. And it was just one of those great things. And he and I would exchange um, Hollywood war stories. I'd go over to his office. He had this great ranch style house right off of Magnolia Boulevard. Marcia Hunt, the great blacklisted actress, lived across the street from him, and she only died just a little while ago. Actually, sad to say. And so we would talk about the business then and now. Nothing had really changed, and Burt left me with one script called "The Ladies from Lonesome." That was kind of Lonesome Dove in reverse. It was a cattle drive, but all the drovers were women who were soiled doves who were looking to make a killing on the cattle market so they could buy a ranch and go straight. An incomplete script, but I was able to pay off that debt as well down the road because we ended up doing a live reading of it at the Autry Museum of Western History in LA. Rob Word, the wonderful producer and purveyor of all things Western, organized it. And we had people like Jim Beaver and Bruce Boxleitner doing all these roles, and it was great to see how well Burt's script played. But you know, I learned a lot from Burt about making sure you never told producers too much. The original draft that I had of that final script ended with the beginning of a chase sequence. And the last line of the script was, to know how this ends, you'll have to finance the movie. So it was just I miss them both, but I especially miss Burt's wit and his um, sardonic take on our misbegotten business.
The book is Ride Lonesome, and it's from UNM Press. And we're lucky enough to get you on the radio today since you're working on the latest book. Please tell me about that. I have no idea.
So another this like Ride Lonesome, the new book will be out through UNM Press, hopefully sometime in the summer or fall of 2025. It's called "They Kill People: Bonnie and Clyde, the Outlaw Cult, and America's Love Affair with Guns." It's a much longer book. It's not just about the film itself. It's a more of a social history about how a particular form of American history that's become our defining myth, this myth of the outlaw, which has been with us from the beginning, but never really existed, has become so much a part of our popular culture. It's now become part of our political culture and our national identity, and the effect that firearms play in this particular piece of American identity. They kill people, as you probably know, was the tagline for the movie Bonnie and Clyde. So the book is structured in a kind of tripartite way. It's partly about the making of the film, and there have been very good accounts of that, like Mark Harris's book, Five Pictures of the Revolution. But there is more to be told, and there was the research unearthed a number of things that hadn't been talked about before. How the movie relates to the history of Bonnie and Clyde themselves, Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker, and then how that Barrow Gang legend plays into who we think we are as Americans. So it's been a great learning experience for me. I had a great time writing the book. The response editorially has been very good. So I'm hopeful it will see the light of day in hardcover next year.
Excellent. And was the Bonnie and Clyde with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, was that a remake or was that the first Bonnie and Clyde film?
Well, that depends on how you look at it. I mean, there were films made before that were certainly impacted by Bonnie and Clyde. The most famous one and the most kind of direct antecedent is a terrific B picture called Gun Crazy, um, directed by Joseph H. Lewis, which it was set in the then contemporary era in the 1950s, but is very much the Bonnie and Clyde story. But Bonnie and Clyde, the film, was the first film to call itself a movie based on the characters themselves. And it takes a lot of liberties, but it also gets a lot of things right, both about them and about America in the 30s and 60s.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've seen it, but I've seen it twice and I just loved it. And I think that, yeah, similar to Ride Lonesome, it's a lot better than you expect. And there's a lot of unexpected
Right.
nuggets and gems of goodness throughout.
And for those who want to see Ride Lonesome, if you don't want to spend the money for the Criterion Collection version of it, I don't blame you. You can certainly get it on Amazon, and from every once in a while, the Criterion Channel itself, the streaming service, does put the Renown films back on, and you can see them if you subscribe.
So we've got about a minute or so left. And of course, we want to remind everybody to get their copy of Ride Lonesome and look out for the new book next year about Bonnie and Clyde. You had a title too, right?
They Kill People is the
They kill,
title.
yeah, look out for They Kill People coming next year. How have you enjoyed getting into writing books? I know we know you mostly for writing TV and movies.
No, I've always wanted to, I started as a journalist. That's how I got into film in the first place. So nonfiction has always been a particular passion of mine. And most of the work I've done as a dramatist has been fact-based, but I've never had the time. I've been lucky to have a fairly consistently active career. But during COVID, I was able to write Ride Lonesome as well as fulfill several of my other screenwriting commitments, and I really got the bug. So when when the first book came out and we were talking about something else I'd want to do, I mentioned something that's a little bit bigger, a little bit meatier, take me a little bit longer to research, something I'd actually been thinking about doing even before I wrote Ride Lonesome. So I love it. I mean, honestly, Jacques, if I could make a living doing this, doing writing those books, that's what I do. But the sad fact of publishing at the moment is that you essentially pay yourself to do the work you enjoy. Of course, it's becoming that in film and television as well. So we'll see how this goes. Talk to me in another year.
Well, and Ride Lonesome is thoroughly and meticulously researched. Do you want to say anything about that before we go? It has a whole
Well, I mean, I got lucky. I got lucky with that. That was actually, during the period I was writing it, all archives were closed. USC's archive was closed. The Academy archive was closed. They were closed everywhere except online. But because I knew Bud and Bird as well as I did, I had boxes and boxes and boxes of archival material, scripts, notebooks, unfinished autobiographies, things like that, to where I could do all my own research and then supplement it where I needed to. Fortunately, with the They Kill People book about Bonnie and Clyde, the archives had opened, and I was able to look at the Warner Brothers archives that are at USC Special Collections, which was amazing. to see. And there's nothing quite beats that physical aspect of research when you can look at photographs, touch things, see Jack Warner's signature, on a script, or where he circled something in Bonnie and Clyde and says no, big letters on it, and they shot it anyway. So it's those kinds of details are just so great. But no, the research process, and for what I do as a dramatist as well, that's the best part of the job, is really getting into the world and marinating my head in those people and times.
Kirk, thanks so much for joining us. Everybody, this was author Kirk Ellis. The book is Ride Lonesome. Make sure to get a copy, and make sure to look out for They Kill People coming next year from UNM Press. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Jack. Always a pleasure. Okay, bye-bye.